Our speaker today is someone that I heard speak about 3 months ago. And I tell you, I was so impressed and surprised at how little I knew about this topic that I knew that I wanted all of my friends and acquaintances in the Quiet Corner to hear what she has to say about zoning reform, and especially as it affects those in the Quiet Corner, but certainly all across the state. Sarah Bronin lives in Hartford. She's a graduate of the University of Texas with degrees in architecture and Spanish. She's a Rhodes Scholar. She has a law degree from Yale. And in addition to being an architect and an attorney, she's a professor at the University of Connecticut. She's also the founder of Desegregate Connecticut. Welcome, Sarah.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm just going to share my screen, so give me a sec. And some of you, I've seen some of you on presentations before, and let's see if I can do my. And so nice to see some of you again. And we have some and been working with many of you, several of you before on our advocacy. But Dorothy, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for that invitation. So Dorothy was just saying, we decided on this topic some months ago, and zoning has been in the news this week. So, but I'll start with just a quick introduction to who we are. In Desegregate Connecticut, we started last year. We are a coalition of neighbors and nonprofits. We know that there's a link between zoning and segregation. That's really why we started, because planners and architects and lawyers got together to start bringing and nonprofit advocates and housing advocates, and just started having a conversation last summer after the George Floyd murder to say, what structural things can we do as in the land use world to change the state of affairs here in Connecticut. So we really focused in on zoning. These are the members of our coalition. Many of them work in the Quiet Corner. Many of them are statewide. They cover a range of topics, so housing advocates like Partnership for Strong Communities, but also environmental organizations, social justice organizations, local organizations that have come together, book clubs and racial justice groups that have come together within individual communities in response to everything that happened last summer as well. We developed over the last year a series of proposals. We have actually 69 members in our coalition. We've done meetings with about a third or probably more of the legislature. We've done a ton of book clubs, community meetings, gatherings, anything we've been invited to, we've gone to, planning and zoning commissions. And we've also held our own events, and they're on our website and recorded, so you can go back to see them. With about a couple thousand attendees. Our overall goal as an organization is really clear for this year that we've started, is that we want to change statewide policy on zoning. It is the state that gives local governments the authority to zone, and the funny thing is last week, so I'm a professor, and I have a zoning treatise that works nationally. And last week I was updating a chapter in this treatise about the Zoning Enabling Act. And we in the treatise we refer to the Zoning Enabling Act of West Virginia, which you would think is a much more backward state in terms of policies on land use, but I had to update that part of the chapter where we refer to West Virginia, because it has a much more modern Zoning Enabling Act. It doesn't refer to the word character. Well, in other ways I'll talk about, it's really much more modern than Connecticut. Connecticut has had this century-old Zoning Enabling Act that really hasn't been updated in a very long time, and it has some pretty outdated concepts when it comes to zoning and planning. And that kind of has locked us into the situation that we see today, where we have a lot of individual towns that are making decisions that they think are good for their individual towns, but are really, they're not even good for their own towns, much less the state as a whole. So that's where we really wanted to target our efforts. Anyway, So just a brief note about zoning. So zoning is control of land use, structures, and lots. And so really briefly, it controls both the kinds of things, the uses that can be done in a community, the structures that can be built in a community, as well as how a lot must be configured, how big it must be, where the buildings can be on the lot. And so with all of these are the three big categories, the way that I conceive it. In each one of those categories, you can really do a lot to constrain housing development and to make it much harder to build things. And that's really what we've seen across Connecticut is little zoning provisions, lots of times that people don't realize that have come together to constrain housing. So what's been in the news this week about zoning reform is that the bill that we've been advocating for passed the House 84 to 59 on a party line vote. There were no Republicans that voted in favor of it. And that happened on Thursday. The interesting thing about the way that the zoning reform debate is played out here is that zoning reform in other states has been very bipartisan. If you look at Massachusetts, they just passed a much stronger zoning enabling reorganization bill and a bill that promotes development around train stations, which you don't have up in your part of Connecticut, but of course is vital to the rest of the state. And in Massachusetts, it was bipartisan, nearly unanimous. The Republican governor was in favor of it because the idea behind a lot of zoning reform concepts is that these local boards have become too restrictive, and so they constrain the free market. So on the Republican side, usually the rhetoric is we want more free market activity, we want more housing to be developed, we want that to happen. And so you see that on that side. Democrats like zoning reform because of the social justice aspects and the fact that more can be built without lots of vetoes. In any case, we see that has happened here in Connecticut. And I do want to say thank you to your reps who voted and have been supporters of zoning reform and who voted for it, Representative Smith, Representative Johnson, and Representative Riley, in addition to your couple of select people who testified in favor of the bill after really conversations about what the bill could do for the quiet corner. So, believe it or not, your part of Connecticut has been very strong in understanding that slowly but surely, if we modernize our zoning codes, it's actually going to be better for your part of Connecticut as well as the state as a whole. So kudos to your elected officials who have been taking the time to learn about what these issues are, taking the time to understand how all of us are interconnected and understand how this very modest reform that we've started this year and hopefully will go through the Senate to the governor's office will carry us forward as a state. So for those of you who've seen my presentation before, I always point folks to our website, which has a whole series of links and analyses about why zoning reform is important. Most of us who started the conversation are motivated by equity. We also have added, and just last week actually released a report about the economic benefits of zoning reform and environmental benefits. This is what that page looks like. So again, feel free to visit if you want to say more, to learn more. But for sure, Connecticut's relationship between zoning and segregation has been studied over and over again. So for those motivated by equity, there's a lot out there on that topic in particular. The other thing I want to bring to your attention in the why category is that we have what we would call one-size-fits-all zoning. We have primarily single-family zoning on large lots. So remember when I said it's the use that matters, but also the lots that matter. Single-family zoning means that refers to the use. Large lots refers to the minimum size that somebody can build. Now, this is not such an issue in rural Connecticut, which I would consider many of the towns represented here to be a part of. That the minimum lot size can sometimes be tied to farming, uses. So that's not so much of an issue as it is to have minimum lot sizes down at the shore, which have really highly inflated prices and constrained how many people can build, particularly around train stations, where you see in some communities 2-acre minimum lot sizes in the neighborhood around a Metro North or Shoreline East station, which just blows my mind. But that's not something that our legislation would address, but it is something I want to bring to your attention as we turn to the next slide, which shows you our map called the Connecticut Zoning Atlas that shows where different uses and where different lot sizes are required. So 91% of Connecticut allows single family housing as a right, and 2% of Connecticut allows 4 or more family housing as a right. Now, again, a lot of that, where that's allowed, does depend on infrastructure, some of which you don't have in your part of Connecticut. But where we do have the infrastructure all up and down the coast, all up and down the New Haven to Hartford line in Waterbury, you still don't see the kind of housing being allowed that we probably do need to start allowing in the state, unless we decide to just become a state of endless sprawl. Within that, those single family zones, about half of those zones require that 2-acre minimum. Now, again, some of that is rural Connecticut, which is a different animal, but a lot of that is areas where we should be developing more densely because we have the infrastructure. A variety of constraints have come together to make Connecticut dead last in housing production, dead last in the entire country, and for months and months on end. If you look in the last few months in particular, it's always been low, but it's now lowest of the low. Nationally, year over year, between March and March, housing production was up 24%. It is down in Connecticut 20%. There are only 3 states in the entire country where production is down. And Connecticut is the lowest percentage. The next one, I think, is 11%, Illinois. That was the same was true last month when we were down 30% and the nation was up 17% year over year from February to February 2021. And so there is something going on here that is really detrimental to our growth as a state. Because we're not building enough housing prices are very expensive. You're seeing that as people from New York have moved to Connecticut and housing prices have skyrocketed. That's why our first-time home buyers, our Connecticut residents are being outbid by people because there's a small amount of housing. At the same time, the higher prices mean that people who can afford living in Connecticut have gotten older. They need to be more established to live here. And that too is an economic problem for Connecticut. We're not attracting young families because we don't have enough housing for them to be here. And, well, maybe I'm not young anymore, but I got young kids, and we need more young families in Connecticut. So we had developed a series of proposals. One of the biggest ones is and some of those are on our website explained a little bit more. I don't mention commissioner training in the next part of the conversation, so I'll just mention it now. These two on the bottom right got stripped out of the bill that passed this year, but we'll come back to those a later year, hopefully. But just really quickly, a couple of them. Accessory dwelling units, which some of your towns do. Well, you can look right here. Many of your towns already allow accessory dwelling units, they look like this: units of land units of housing that are attached or detached from the main lot. Just going back to this slide. But as you see on the right, lots of towns have constraints on accessory dwelling units that make them harder to build. So our proposal is that which is in the law now, is that they be allowed, legalized in every town. There is now an opt-out provision where 2/3 of the Planning Commission and 2/3 of the legislative body have to opt out of what the state is asking for, which is the part that we don't like, of course. That was inserted at the last minute. But states that have allowed accessory dwelling units, okay, this is that term as of right, which we could talk about if there are questions, but that allowed accessory dwelling units have seeing a lot of production of this. California is an example. They've seen tens of thousands of new units of ADUs in just 3 years, 11-fold increase in LA alone, and that increases people's property value. So if you're a property owner, a homeowner, and you have room on your property and you want to create an ADU, that usually not only creates a unit of housing, but helps you as the homeowner to increase the value of your home, because of course it's a lot easier to sell if you can have that small unit for extra. Pandemic times, a lot of people are kicking themselves for not having ADUs, and of course to rent out as well. We also have provisions on parking, which are not as relevant in your part of the state as other parts of the state. Probably a model form-based code that we have that's in the bill now. So a commission would help to develop what's called a form-based code, which would help towns through zoning pick and choose what. It's a model code that the state would develop. So they would say, okay, this is the building type that fits in my town, in Pomfret, and so we will be able to just pull out pages from that code, adopt them into individual town zoning codes, and help give towns a better way to get a handle on character. Our proposals also included provisions that were very changes to the provision in our state enabling acts that said that towns had to consider character, which in other places, including that West Virginia statute that I talked about, have been that word has been entirely eliminated from state statutes. And so that was our proposal. And what's in the bill now is physical site characteristics, which is hopefully going to be helpful. So I didn't want to talk too much, just on the codes part. Those are optional, they're free. We had some other things in there. The commissioner training made it through. New ways to measure traffic. Again, probably not so much an issue. It empowers towns to do that. We're hoping that this is what we got accomplished this session as a first step. We do see a lot of support for these proposals. So the bill was SB 1024. I didn't update the slide for this week. It's now HB 6107. There was 71% of testimony in favor of the bill, the people who spoke in favor of it. 100% of young people spoke in favor of zoning reform. And by young, I mean anybody that appeared to be 40 and younger. We've had tons of op-eds in favor. We know that reform will generate more revenue for the state, more job activity, more income for people in the state. And that's why, again, we've seen a lot of support for it in the press. We've gotten editorials in the Day and in the Hearst papers down in Fairfield County, and a lot of individuals who have stepped up to write their own takes on why zoning reform matters to them. So that's it. And I'm interested to see your thoughts, conversations, and reactions. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. I know that people have questions, so if you'll put them in the chat, that would be really great. But while we're waiting for those to appear, Sarah, talk a little bit more about what actually did get passed and when it would go into effect. Has the governor signed it?
Yep. So it's absolutely. So it has just passed the House of Representatives. We're looking for it to get taken up in the Senate. So one of the things you guys can do, being active members of your community, is to encourage your senators to take an interest in the bill. Like I said, unfortunately, it seems to be on a party line vote, which is really short-sighted. But anyway, I would encourage you to nonetheless contact your legislators and say that your senators and say you're interested. You can contact the governor's office too, although he did have a quote this week saying that he supported this bill. So what did pass is the legalization of accessory dwelling units with an opt-out. That those parking provisions that capped the amount of parking that towns could require of towns, that also has an opt-out. And again, it's really the shoreline towns that we've seen a lot of abuse of parking standards. And what those are, if you build a unit of housing, you have to build X number of parking units. Darien, Connecticut, which is, as you know, a very wealthy town, requires 3 parking spaces for 1 studio apartment. There's no way that a studio apartment dweller needs 3 parking spaces. So why would they have that? And maybe it was just an oversight, or maybe it was a way to make building a studio apartment more expensive in Darien. So that's what the parking, those are what the parking provisions are meant to curb. The commissioner training, so commissioners will have biannual training requirements. Lots of states have those requirements. And so Connecticut, again, is modernizing in its approach. If you think about it, zoning commissioners have a ton of power because they dictate every single thing that gets built in your town. They have power really to dictate the whole economic structure of your town. So a lot of times, well-meaning volunteers, people are excited to do it, but they come to the table without really the sort of big picture grounding that you need. I'm a land use law professor. I write treatises in land use law. I get trained as often as I can. I go to, training all the time because there's always something to learn, because this area of law changes a lot. That kind of training also saves towns money, which is why you saw towns and CCM in support, because there's so many towns that get sued because of their commissioners who made decisions that are not in accordance with the most updated case law. So that's, we think, a really good one. There are also provisions in the bill about a couple of technical standards that have been used to thwart housing. There's a provision in the bill that would, there's a lot of reorganization. So basically making it a lot clearer what towns can and can't do, but a lot of that is existing law. There's a provision that incorporates the federal affirmatively furthering fair housing standard, which by incorporating it into our provisions, it doesn't put towns and cities into having a new legal obligation, but it kind of just helps to mirror what's in federal law. So yeah, so that's some of it. And again, it passed 84 to 59. So we know that it represents a good compromise for this session, but obviously we hope to do a lot more in future sessions.
Great. Well, we're getting a lot of questions for you on this. And here's one from Christine Pate from Coventry, and she asked what the status of the new sewer rigs are on any of this.
Yes, so that commission that I mentioned that's being created for the model form-based code guidelines, that commission will also take the rules on septic and look at those. So originally in our bill, we had a couple of provisions on septic systems. They included a provision that is in the bill, which allows for accessory dwelling units and primary units to be treated as one system, as opposed to a community sewerage system, which bumps them up into much more onerous requirements. That's still in the bill. What's not in the bill is the increase in stormwater gallonage, septic system gallonage capacity that was originally in our bill, so that reviews could take place under DPH regulations as opposed to deep regulations. That part of the bill has been kicked over to this commission, which will hopefully agree with what all of our experts and environmentalists and home builders all said was actually just fine for the environment.
Okay, here's another question. Do you have a handout regarding the benefits of affordable housing? In my town of Stratford, the Republican leadership is against affordable housing, and I'd like to educate our community regarding the benefits.
Yeah, I'm going to put in a chat a link to the op-ed page for you, because we had a great op-ed recently from Stratford. Let me just make sure that it's not plural. So yeah, no, that's right. So I would encourage you to connect with that person who is also from Stratford. We don't have a handout so much I would encourage you to go to the Partnership for Strong Communities website, and actually it's linked to our page. It's called ct.org data. So if you go to this page that says data, you'll be able to link to the housing profiles page. And what you'll see on that page is that you can click on your town and you can see the affordability characteristics. And you're going to see, and I can tell you right now, because we have it on our zoning atlas. I'll put the link to that in your chat. That people in Stratford are just as cost burdened as people in any other part of the state. So let me just click on Stratford really quickly, and I'll tell you right now the percentage of people who are cost burdened in your town. 41% of people in Stratford are cost burden. That means they spend more than 30% of their income on housing. That is an extreme, that's actually higher than a lot of other towns. So I think when you go through those housing profiles, you'll be able to pull out some numbers to show we have a problem right here in Stratford, and it's with homeowners too, because 41% of the people it's not just renters. So I think going through that might be a really good place to mine. Okay, good. Looks like you know the person who wrote the op-ed. Great.
Okay, actually that question was from Dr. Immaculata Khan. Here's another question from Janet Bellamy, who lives in Ashford. She asks, with building and land costs so high in Connecticut, do you think affordable housing will be built without tax incentives?
So part of the reason that land costs are so high is because we constrain so much what can be built on them. So if you think of you ever been exposed to just basic principles of economics, when you have more supply, the costs go down. When there's not so many things to buy, the costs go up. What we have in Connecticut is the latter scenario, where we have constrained the amount of land, we have constrained the amount of housing that can be built on the same amount of land. So use that 2-acre, one single family home example. Again, not relevant to your area, but more relevant to the denser towns. You see that there is a lot of demand to build more housing, and people don't want the market doesn't want 2-acre minimum single family zoning anymore. If you look at the way the demographics are trending, more people are living alone, more people are living longer. You have the young families who who can't afford to live in Connecticut, but that demographic wants walkable communities. That's why you see the AARP and similar organizations kind of going towards the same direction, like walkability accessory dwelling units. They've gotten into zoning policy too, because again, shifting demographics are really not going away from that direction, but yet that's what we allow to be built. So yes, definitely housing can be supported by tax and financing incentives, but the reason that more housing can't be built is because of the kinds of constraints that we put in all of our communities on new housing.
Great. Here's one from Charles Parasino. How would changing the consideration of character affect decisions made by local planning and zoning commissions? My state rep has been very fervent in opposition to this bill, but I did notice all 3 towns in our district, Tallinn, Ashford, and Wellington, already allow ADUs.
Yeah, so we've been out to Tallinn, the Planning and Zoning Commission. It was a great conversation. And you're right that lots of towns already allow ADUs, and you're also right that some of the opposition doesn't really make any sense because of the way that towns already are starting to move in that direction. And the fact that this bill that is currently under consideration is fairly limited. It's not a big lift, this bill. It's really just like barely getting Connecticut into a modern approach. The two changes to character are, as I said, changing the way, so not requiring towns to use character, changing that to physical site characteristics. But there's also a provision that says that when they're considering an individual application, then I'm just going to read that it says you can't deny an application on the basis of character unless it's expressly articulated in standards for site work and structures. So in other words, unless you have a form-based code or something that says, here's the neighborhood, physical characteristics, you can't just throw out this term character, which has been used by commissions to say, well, these people would change the character of the town. You know, if we let in multifamily housing, we're going to get people that change the character. And that has been used to justify denials of new housing that are allowed under the terms of the zoning regulations. That's why they got to the public hearing in the first place. But then at the public hearing, people have thrown this word around to deny housing. So what we're saying is, you can't talk about the people. There's another provision that's in that same section that says you can't deny a land use application based on immutable characteristics, source of income, or income level of any applicant, other than age or disability, which has special rules that you can discriminate on the basis of age, because you can't have elderly only housing, you can't have disability oriented housing. So that's where, you know, that's kind of how that's articulated. But the opposition, yeah, I mean, I can't explain it.
Okay, well, we have about 15 more minutes and 10 more questions. So Pomfret is in the process of updating their ADU regs. How does 6107 impact those reg changes? This is from Ray Wisher.
Yeah, so I think it from what I have been hearing through the grapevine, Pomfret is going in the exact direction of the state, what the state law that just passed it would do. So I think you're legalizing ADUs. Well, I'll just tell you what's in the state law, and you can tell me. You know, legalizing ADUs, making them allowed, allowing them in detached housing as well as attached housing, attached to the main floor. The floors in the state bill are 30% of the main unit, or up to 1,000 square feet. That's pretty much the average that we've seen in regulations across the state. And we have analyzed, I should have said, 32,000 pages of regulations across the state. So we're pretty familiar with that, with what all the regs say. It would, but it would give Pomfret the ability still to do architectural standards. You don't want 2 front doors, probably. You know, you'd write regs for that. You could also ban Airbnb or short-term rentals. That's in the bill. It says Pomfret can do that. So, you know, you may have that pressure. Some towns do have that pressure from vacationers. And I mean, if you're doing those things, you're probably fully in, you know, in conformance or in agreement with what's on the table now.
Right. How could additional mixed-use zoning benefit or hurt the communities in the Quiet Corner?
So one of our main partners two of our main partners in our coalition are Preservation Connecticut and the Connecticut Main Street Center, both of which work with small town main streets all the time. The reason they're part of our program is because, and I think, you know, I guess I would assume that a lot of the commercial activity or the mixed use activity in your towns is concentrated on what you might consider the historic Main Street, or the sort of main corridor that's always been there. You know, we're not necessarily talking about Amazon headquarters that are kind of sprawled out in farmland. So, you know, if we're focused on those historic areas, what we have seen over time, over the decades in Connecticut, is that those main streets have actually been rezoned to only allow commercial uses. Historically, they used to allow residential businesses upstairs or behind the store, or, you know, on the same lot, but really before zoning, because zoning only started existing 100 years ago. So a lot of our communities developed before that. Before zoning, you had a much bigger mix of uses in commercial and residential areas. What you've seen with zoning is that, again, probably because of the lack of training, commissioners have over the decades zoned out residential from commercial areas. So what that means is that you don't have feet on the street to support businesses. You don't have like a built-in consumer base right in that area. And you also don't have the opportunity to create those walkable communities that more and more people are saying they want. It also means that people aren't able to, if they want to stay in a town, but not have that 1 or 2 acre house, they don't have other options where they can get, you know, maybe not use their car so much, maybe have a little grocery store next door. So mixed use zoning in the right places in your town can really make a big difference to people's quality of life and can really help to retain people to stay in your town who can't do that now because because of that one size fits all zoning. So I mean, if you're looking at zoning in your town, I would take a look at what's allowed. And actually, you can go to our zoning atlas and check that out. You can zoom into, and I'll put that in the chat. Oh, I think I did. You can zoom into your town and see whether housing is allowed on main streets. And what we found is that lots of places have reversed what happened 100 years ago. And we're saying, let's put it back in. Let's put housing back in those main streets. But that is not in the bill. So that's just something you can do if you want.
Richard Ives asks, why is the opposition so vehemently opposed? It's been very hard to defend the bill against inaccuracies from the Republicans.
I have no idea for select person. I just really don't. Again, this has been a bipartisan issue in other states. I mean, maybe it's me, maybe it's because of my husband. I just have no idea because it really makes no sense. And if you look to our economic brief, I'll put that in the chat too, actually. If you look at our economic brief, research overwhelmingly shows that once you loosen zoning rules in a smart way to allow housing, that has a slew of positive economic effects. So even if you don't care anything at all about equity, there's that brief. The economic argument for zoning reform is clear. And so you would think that the party of, economics and fiscal responsibility would embrace this because it's overwhelming. There are no studies that show that this is a bad thing for the economy. So I think it's just, I don't know. I can't explain it.
That's pretty understandable. Here's Brian Anderson, who lives in Mansfield. I've lived in towns where Republicans predictably use zoning as a scare tactic to channel the white vote. Are there any examples where this sort of racist tactic has been successfully fought?
So this is where I do think that and since it's become a partisan issue, I'll talk partisan right now. This is where I think Democrats have a real advantage. Right now, and you saw this over the last few months when you saw that all that chatter from Fairfield County, save our local home rule, which by the way is not even a legal concept in Connecticut because we're not a home rule state. But anyway, the Democrats have an opportunity to say, look at this thing that we're doing, whether it's at the state level or at the local level. Zoning reform can address equity issues, but it's also smart economic policy. It's also smart environmental policy. I think if we start talking, if Democrats start talking and saying proactively, this is actually one of the smartest things we're going to do for our town. There's a lot of case studies on small towns that have done zoning reform that has helped them blossom. It has helped attract new residents. It has helped to fortify the economy, especially Main Street businesses. I mean, if together, and you could do it as a region, you say this region is going to tackle this issue and say, we're going to do this in a positive way. The reason why the narrative has been controlled by those very small Republican voices, very small number of Republican voices, is because they're willing to talk about it. And I think Democrats haven't been willing to talk about it because they're worried that somebody is going to say, oh, well, that you're against homeowners. But the ADU is a prime example. That is very pro homeowner. That is enabling homeowners to unlock the value of their homes. It's a great economic, argument. It's a great common sense argument. And during the pandemic, it would have been common sense for everybody to have one of these, so that their college kids weren't, using their kitchens. They had their own kitchens. Go away, So I think that this is an opportunity, and hopefully the success of this zoning reform legislation at the State House will help encourage Democrats to turn around and say, you know what, zoning reform is smart economic, smart environmental, smart equity, and just really, I think it's safety in numbers. I think once more Democrats start doing that, then those voices will start to look short-sighted, smaller and smaller, and get drowned out, and we'll start to reverse this. also our movement is looking forward to see what can we do to recruit land use commissioners where they're elected, or recruit people to be raise their hand to be appointed. Because the other thing that we've seen is across the state, a lot of the planning and land use commissioners have been entrenched in their positions for decades. They just sit on these commissions, and that's why nothing changes. So this is another opportunity to turn things around and say, if we have people who are committed to looking at best practices in zoning that are good for my town, that changeover and this hopefully new interest in this area of regulation will help move Connecticut forward, but also will just help move individual towns forward.
Hey, Cindy Dunn, why are they called in-law apartments? After the in-law dies, then there's an apartment on the property. Thompson changed the in-law apartment to accessory apartments. This creates zoning compliance when the in-law is no longer being used as an in-law, when the apartment is no longer used by the in-law.
So we have seen, you're exactly right. Many towns, not many, but a good, some chunk of towns, that's not a majority by any means, but some chunk of towns require the person living in the unit to be a relative or to be an employee. The state legislation that we just passed would say that towns can't do that anymore. And the reason is because it basically takes those out of commission. And not only that, it's a compliance issue. You know, what zoning enforcement officer is going to go into someone's unit and say, are you a mother-in-law or not? You know, show me your ID, show me the marriage certificates. Nobody wants to do that. And that's why we had strong support from the Planners Association and the zoning enforcement official for that particular provision, because when a planning and zoning commission says, oh, well, this is what we want, it creates total havoc for the staff. And so that's one of the things it would change.
Right, you know, that's true. In my town of Coventry, you can build an in-law apartment only with a special waiver, but when that person dies, the waiver only allows another relative to move into the apartment. So that's something that really should be changed.
Yeah, and that's a market constraint, because then the homeowner is stuck. Maybe the new homeowner is not even married, so they don't have an in-law. So you know, what do you do in that situation? It's just common sense. But again, you have these zoning commissioners who don't realize that's the implication of what they're doing. So they're basically telling this homeowner, go and invest and put money into and go through the public hearing process and, you know, do all of this in our town, and it does not make sense. It's not common sense.
Right. So once this legislation is signed into law, what can we do in our own communities to implement some of these policies?
Well, I think, you know, as I said, I think one of the biggest things is actually trying to get people who are open-minded about zoning best practices to start serving on these boards. And it could be you, Charles. That would be great. You know, you're a young person in your town. And I think raise your hand and say, look, I'm interested. And, you know, if if it's an appointed position, you'd have to convince the select person that you're not a wild radical. If it's an elected position, go door to door. It's worth it. It's actually worth it, because you're making decisions that have a huge impact on the long-term viability of your town. So in terms of implementing, I would say raise your hand and you know, get out there and you know, try to serve yourself. But the other thing you can do is just to make sure your select people and your town leadership understands that these are issues that are good for your town, that the more you think about these issues, the better it is. You know, here in Hartford, I chaired the Zoning Commission for 7 years. We worked really hard to incorporate essentially every national best practice in zoning for a city of our size. Wouldn't work out where you are, but you know, a lot of the things that we incorporated were, we have no public hearings for housing now. We have accessory dwelling units. We have tons of sustainability, electric vehicle, you know, green roof, you know, all of that stuff. Because of that, we've gotten attention from national developers who are coming in and investing in Hartford in new ways, and local developers too, of course. So that's a good thing to meet our needs in our town. And I think a lot of towns up there could use, in your area, could not on the scale of Hartford, you know, but could use just a fresh approach to development that would encourage the right kind of development, the development you want, the form-based, use the form-based code to make sure you're not getting something you don't want. But you probably need a little bit more investment, and a little shift can go a long way.
Yeah, I think that oftentimes filling seats on planning and zoning doesn't get as much thoughtfulness about who we're putting on and what their beliefs are. It's like, it's about what the storefront looks like if they're going to put up a new sign at the grocery store, or and people haven't paid enough attention to who's getting elected or appointed to that important board.
It's reactive. It's a lot of the commissions, they stick with the rules they have, and they're just implementing the rules rather than thinking, how can we change these? And it's not a difficult, we've since 2016, when we first did our code, we've revised the Hartford Code again 15 additional times to correct things or to fix things, or okay, this came up. So we have taken on this approach of, the rules are not working for this use, the rules don't help us, let's fix it, rewrite it. And that's really not many planning commissions take that approach. They react to what's already on the page. And so hopefully this will generate more regulatory review and activity.
Well, we have a real activist on our Planning and Zoning Commission now, with Christine Pate, who's been working a lot on trying to get us some housing for seniors. And one of the things she has talked about was changing the words affordable housing to attainable housing, so that it doesn't look like the town was just looking to bring in poor people or people of color and gets them all nervous. Anyway, the words that they use are really important, and who's on that commission. And we are very lucky to have somebody who's paying attention to all this and paying attention to you. So in your last few minutes, what would you like to tell us that you haven't told us so far?
I mean, just stay on top of this issue, because it's really an important one, and it means a lot to Connecticut. All of these, actually over the weekend too, I've been looking at some, so I was born in 1978. I was looking at reports done in 1978 from the Connecticut Commission on Human Rights. That commission has previously studied zoning, and everything that it says in the 1978 report, the year I was born, is still true. All of the observations about exclusionary zoning tactics, all of the observations about the detriment to Connecticut's economy, all of those, all of the towns that they view as the worst offenders, the most severe restrictions on zoning, they're all true still today. So we haven't changed anything in my entire lifetime. And, I'm sure many of it probably goes back further than that, but I just use my own lifetime as a benchmark to say, we have an opportunity right now. There's a tension on this issue, for better or for worse. We did not know what we were doing when we started in June. We did not know that we would build a coalition. We didn't know we would have a bill. We did not know any of this would happen. But I think the fact that it has happened, and the fact that we have had people approach us to be part of it, and people sign up to our mailing list and so on, speaks to the fact that this is an issue that is underappreciated, and we've under advocated for this. And so I do think that this is a good, solid, smart issue for Democrats to continue at all levels to be at the forefront of, and to try different things and to be innovative. And again, I think that the fact that we've gotten where we've gotten it's unfortunate in a way, because it shows that there was such a need, or such a yearning to try to change some of these things, but it also gives us a really strong base. So please stay involved, sign up to our mailing list, follow us on Twitter if you're on Twitter, Desegregate CT, and just please reach out to me. And I'll put our general email in the chat. We're always happy to come to towns. We're always happy to talk to planning commissions, provide advice on the side, whatever it is you need. We've somehow become a clearinghouse. And by the way, most of the people who work with us are people in their 20s, college students, law students, policy students, architecture students. We have a team of about 18 core volunteers right now. And the fact that they're spending their time to help with this movement, again, suggests they desperately want to have a place to live here in Connecticut. So I do think that this is a movement that has, that you'll see in the future, and we'd love your input as we go along. So thank you guys so much for having me.
Thanks, Sarah. And I would like to tell everyone that I know there's been choices about which workshop to go to. And Chris Pitts, our leader for the Quiet Corner Dems, is recording all of the presentations. And sometime in the next few weeks, they'll all be available. So if you attended this one and want your friends to see it too, they'll be able to see it, because we really do want to have communities that are more inclusive. And also, just so, as Sarah said, when your child gets out of college, comes back home, or decides to go to the community college, they can still find a place to live in your community. So thank you very much. For those of you who are going to the next workshop in Zone 1, stay where you are.